puzzle lover, I think I've got the ultimate brain teaser for you.
Oh, do tell.
It's called On the Origin of Species, and let me tell you, Darwin really went all out with this one.
Ah, Darwin. Talk about a game changer. You got some of those excerpts for us.
You bet. Ready for a deep dive?
Let's do it.
Okay, so picture this. The world is buzzing with life, right? But how did we get from, like, single-celled organisms to all this amazing diversity?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Darwin's answer, natural selection.
Natural selection, so it's not just like random chance.
Not quite. It's more like survival of the fittest. Darwin noticed that within any species, you've got all these little differences, these variations.
Okay, so like some dogs are tiny, some are huge, some are built for speed.
Exactly. And those variations, those quirks, they can be passed down from parents to offspring. It's inheritance in action.
Okay, so if you're a cheetah built for speed, chances are your cubs are going to inherit those need for speed genes. But how does that lead to, like, a whole new species? Is it just generations of getting faster and faster?
It's a bit more complicated than that. See, Darwin realized that more individuals are born than can actually survive.
Oh yeah, resources are limited. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Or, well, cheetah-eat-gazelle world, I guess.
Exactly. Darwin called it the struggle for existence. Food, water, mates. It's a constant competition.
Okay, so I'm seeing the pieces come together here. We've got those inherent variations, and then you've got this pressure cooker of competition.
And that, my friend, is where the magic happens.
Yeah.
Individuals with even the slightest advantage in that struggle, maybe they're faster, maybe they're better camouflaged, they're the ones who are more likely to survive. And crucially, they're more likely to reproduce and pass those traits on.
So it's like nature's running a giant experiment, constantly selecting for the traits that work best in a given environment.
A perfect analogy. And because environments are always changing, climates shift, new predators emerge, the traits that are advantageous, well, they change too. It's a constant dance between variation, inheritance, and this struggle for existence.
Darwin's theory of natural selection. Okay, now I see why it caused such a stir. But Darwin, he didn't just hang out with wild animals, did he? Weren't there some pigeons involved?
Ah, yes. Darwin's pigeons. He was obsessed with them. He was fascinated by how breeders could create such a huge range of pigeon breeds, all from a single ancestral species. He called it artificial selection.
So, like, those fancy pigeons with the crazy feathers, they hold the key to understanding how a giraffe got its neck.
Think of it this way.
Mm.
Those breeders, they're selecting for specific traits, right? A certain beak shape, a certain feather pattern. They're basically controlling which pigeons get to reproduce.
And they end up with all these wildly different pigeons. Okay, I'm seeing the connection here. So
Yeah,
nature's doing the same thing, just on a much grander scale.
exactly. With pigeons, it's the breeders calling the shots. In the wild, it's the environment, the natural selectors, if you will.
It's like those breeders are giving us a sneak peek into the power of selection, just on fast forward.
Exactly. And those wildly different pigeon breeds. They were a powerful argument for Darwin's point. Species aren't fixed. They can change dramatically over time.
Speaking of change, one of the things that struck me from the excerpts you sent was Darwin's observations about where different species lived. He noticed that geography played a role in all of this, didn't he?
Another piece of the puzzle. He observed that species living in similar environments, but different parts of the world often had similar adaptations, even if they weren't closely related.
Like similar types of birds on different continents, evolving those similar features independently.
Exactly. And then there were the islands. Darwin found that islands often had species that were like variations on a theme, closely related to those on the nearest mainland, but with distinct differences.
So if species were just plunked down in pre-designed environments, as many people believed at the time, those patterns wouldn't make much sense.
Right. But if they evolved from ancestors that migrated and adapted to new homes over time, well, suddenly those geographic patterns make perfect sense.
It's all starting to come together. Okay, so we've got all these species evolving and branching out. It's like a giant family reunion.
Darwin had a beautiful way of visualizing that. The tree of life. Picture a massive tree, with each branch representing a different lineage.
So the trunk is like the common ancestor, and as you go up, the branches diverge, representing new species splitting off.
Precisely. Species that are closely related, they share a more recent common ancestor. They're on branches closer together. Those that are very different, like humans and bacteria, they're on branches that diverged much earlier in evolutionary history.
So it's not just a random assortment of creatures, but this vast, interconnected web of life. Makes you think about our own family trees, doesn't it?
It does, and Darwin argued that this branching process, this entire tree of life, it's all sculpted by natural selection.
It's an elegant theory, but Darwin himself admitted it wasn't perfect, right? Something about the fossil record.
You're right. Darwin knew the fossil record of his time was incomplete. He saw this as a limitation because it didn't always show those clear transitions between species that his theory predicted.
So he was basically saying, I'm pretty sure this is how it works, but we need more evidence to complete the picture.
Exactly. He predicted that as our understanding of geology and paleontology advanced, we'd uncover more of those missing links.
Basically, he was confident that we'd eventually find the receipts to support his theory.
And he was right. In the years since, on the origin of species, countless fossil discoveries have filled in those gaps.
It's remarkable, isn't it, how he was able to deduce so much with the limited evidence available at the time. But there's one last thing I'm curious about from these excerpts: instincts. Animals just seem to know certain things, right? A spider spins a web without ever being taught. How did Darwin even begin to explain that?
That's a great question, and it highlights one of the most fascinating aspects of his work. Let's delve into that in more detail.
Okay, so instincts. We were talking about how animals just seem to know certain things. Like, a spider doesn't have to go to web spinning class, it just knows.
It's almost like they come pre-programmed with certain behaviors, isn't it?
Exactly. But how do you explain that with a theory that's all about gradual change?
It was a question that Darwin grappled with. After all, you can't have half a web-spinning instinct.
Right. It either works or it doesn't.
Precisely. But Darwin believed that even complex instincts could be shaped by natural selection, bit by bit, over generations.
So a bird building a nest, a beaver building a dam, those evolved in a similar way to physical traits.
That was his argument. Imagine tiny variations in those instinctive behaviors popping up randomly. Maybe a bird is instinctively drawn to certain materials or to weave a slightly stronger nest.
And if those variations give the offspring even a slight edge in terms of survival.
Exactly. Those offspring are more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, and more likely to pass on those slightly better nest-building instincts.
And over time, those tiny improvements add up to those complex instincts we see. It's like they're unconsciously perfecting their craft, generation after generation.
Precisely. Guided by the invisible hand of selection. Darwin argued that even those seemingly innate actions, those things we call instincts, they've been honed by the forces of survival and reproduction over vast stretches of time.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm guessing not everyone was on board with Darwin's ideas. I mean, even today, people struggle with the idea that something as complex as an eye could have evolved through random chance.
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the biggest criticisms leveled at Darwin's theory.
It does seem like a huge leap, right? From nothing to a fully functioning eye.
Right, but Darwin argued that even the most complex structures could evolve gradually, through a series of small, advantageous steps. He pointed out that eyes in nature, well, they're not all created equal. There's a huge amount of diversity.
Okay, so some creatures have those simple light-sensitive spots, and then you've got, well, us with our high-definition vision.
Exactly. And there's a whole spectrum in between. Each step along the way, from a simple light-sensitive patch of skin to a cupped structure that can detect the direction of light, to a lens that can focus that light, each step offered some kind of survival advantage.
So each little improvement gave those creatures an edge, and natural selection took care of the rest.
Precisely. Those improvements didn't go to waste. They were passed on and refined over countless generations.
I can see how that might work over millions of years. But even if you accept that, Darwin didn't have all the answers, did he? Like, he couldn't point to a fossil that showed every single stage of eye evolution.
You're right. Darwin knew that the fossil record was incomplete. He acknowledged that as a limitation.
So how did he convince people? Did he just ask them to take a leap of faith?
He presented a mountain of evidence. He meticulously documented the diversity of life, those patterns of geographical distribution we talked about, the existence of rudimentary organs.
Rudimentary organs, those are like the evolutionary leftovers.
Exactly. Structures that have lost their original function, like our appendix, or the wings of flightless birds, or the pelvic bones of whales.
It does make you wonder, why would a creator include those useless parts?
Exactly. But if you view those organs as remnants of a species' ancestry, suddenly they become clues.
Clues to how life on Earth has changed over time.
Precisely. Darwin argued they offered a glimpse into evolutionary history. And he also pointed to artificial selection, the way breeders could dramatically alter species in a relatively short amount of time, as an analogy for what nature could accomplish over a much longer timescale.
It's like he was saying, look, I can't show you every single step in the process, but look at all this evidence. It all points to evolution by natural selection.
Exactly. He built a compelling case, even with those inevitable knowledge gaps, and he was confident that, as science progressed, those gaps would be filled.
And of course, he was right. We've learned so much since Darwin's time. But there's one thing we haven't touched on yet: extinction.
A crucial aspect of his theory, and one that really challenged the prevailing view at the time.
Which was that species were fixed and unchanging.
Exactly. Darwin saw extinction not as a failure of creation, but as an inevitable consequence of natural selection.
So as environments change and new, better adapted species emerge, the older, less competitive ones, well, they fade away.
Precisely. It's survival of the fittest on a grand scale.
It's a bit of a sobering thought, but it also highlights the dynamism of life, doesn't it? This constant cycle of emergence, adaptation, and, yes, sometimes disappearance.
Absolutely. Darwin argued that extinction wasn't just a loss, it was also a creative force. It freed up resources in ecological niches, allowing new forms of life to evolve.
It's like nature hitting the reset button, clearing the stage for the next act.
A dramatic analogy, but I think Darwin would appreciate it. And it leads us to another critical element of his theory, the vastness of geological time.
Right. These changes we're talking about, those don't happen overnight. You need a lot more time than a few thousand years to go from a single-celled organism to, well, us.
Exactly. Darwin argued that the Earth was far older than most people at the time believed. He saw those layers of rock with their embedded fossils as a testament to vast stretches of time.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it. Our time on this planet is just a blip in the grand scheme of things.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? And it's only when you grasp the vastness of geological time that you can truly appreciate the incredible journey life has taken.
A journey that ultimately led to us. Which brings us to what I think is the biggest question of all. How do you go from variation within a species to the birth of entirely new ones?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you get from one species to the incredible diversity we see today?
Darwin must have had some idea.
He did. He argued that the key was something called reproductive isolation. Basically, you need to stop groups within a species from interbreeding. Think of it like this. Imagine a population of birds that gets divided by a new mountain range.
Okay, so now they're stuck on opposite sides, unable to mingle.
Exactly. They're reproductively isolated. Over time, each group faces different challenges, different opportunities. They start accumulating different variations, different adaptations.
And even if those mountains erode away and those two groups meet up again.
They might be so different that they're no longer able to interbreed. They become separate species.
What was once one species has now branched into two.
And that process, repeated over millions and millions of years, is how Darwin explained the incredible diversity of life on Earth.
It really is like that tree of life, constantly branching and diverging. It's such a powerful image.
A beautiful analogy for a beautiful theory.
It's incredible how much ground Darwin covered. It's like we've taken a crash course in evolutionary biology.
We have. But we've only scratched the surface. Darwin's work was incredibly profound, and it continues to shape our understanding of the world today.
And you know what's amazing? Even though he was tackling these huge questions, he often used really relatable examples.
Exactly. He had a way of taking complex ideas and illustrating them in ways that everyone could understand. But those simple examples, they were underpinned by years of meticulous observation and rigorous scientific thought.
It really is amazing how Darwin could take something as complex as, well, the whole history of life on Earth and make it feel understandable.
He really had a knack for finding the perfect example, didn't he?
Like those pigeons. Who would have thought you could learn so much from a pigeon?
It speaks to his genius as a scientist, I think. Not only a brilliant observer, but a brilliant communicator, too.
And it's inspiring, don't you think? Like, you don't need a fancy lab to engage with these big questions about life, just curiosity.
Absolutely. Darwin saw evidence for evolution everywhere he looked.
He really did. The variety within species, the way life was distributed across the globe, even those, what were they called?
Rudimentary organs?
Yeah, those. It's like he was piecing together this giant puzzle and he was inviting everyone to come along for the ride.
And it's a puzzle we're still working on today. As much as Darwin discovered, he really opened the door to so much more.
Like, he gave us the map, and we've been filling in the details ever since. But I'm guessing not everyone was thrilled to see that map, were they? I mean, his ideas challenged some pretty fundamental beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. Darwin knew he was shaking things up. He wasn't just presenting scientific findings, he was challenging deeply held beliefs about, well, humanity's place in the universe.
It's a bit mind-blowing when you think about it. I mean, today, evolution is just, well, accepted science, right? But back then,
It was revolutionary
yeah,
and controversial. But the fact that his ideas have not only endured but become so central to our understanding of life, well, that says something.
it really does. And it's not just biology, is it? His work has had this ripple effect, influencing everything from philosophy to art.
Darwin's reach is a lot wider than people realize.
Totally. But for all his genius, Darwin himself knew he didn't have all the answers, right?
He was very humble that way. He knew he was just scratching the surface.
He acknowledged those gaps in the fossil record, the things he couldn't quite explain yet.
He was honest about the limitations of his work, which made his discoveries all the more powerful.
It's like he was saying, this is what I've found so far, but the search for knowledge, it never really ends.
Exactly. He was never afraid to say, I don't know, and then go looking for answers.
I think that's what I find most inspiring about Darwin, that endless curiosity. And he found that sense of wonder in the most unexpected places.
You really did. Remember that line from the excerpt you sent? Something like, there is grandeur in this view of life.
Grandeur, such a powerful word. And he wasn't talking about some majestic landscape. He was talking about, well, everything.
It really captures the essence of his perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That even in the smallest, seemingly most ordinary creatures, there's this whole incredible story unfolding.
It's a good reminder for all of us, isn't it? To look a little closer at the world around us. You never know what you might discover.
You really don't.
Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about today. Any final words of wisdom from Darwin you'd like to leave them with?
I think Darwin would tell them what any good scientist, or really any curious person, would say. Never stop asking questions. Never stop exploring.
And never underestimate the power of a good pigeon.
Never underestimate the power of a good pigeon.
I think that's a wrap on this deep dive into On the Origin of Species. Thanks so much for joining me today. It's been fascinating.
The pleasure was all mine. Really. Until next time.